Welcome, everyone. You are at the Old Sports New Life Outdoor Culture in Cities panel, and we actually heard that Obama was in town, and he tried to get a ticket here, but he didn't win the lottery. So congrats to all of you guys for being here. My name's Sarah, and I'm the founder of Outdoor Fest. It's an outdoor adventure festival based in New York City with community events that happen in various cities around the country. And our goal is to connect urban dwellers to outdoor recreation through these events that mainly focus on community building. And this awesome panel we have before all of you represents a mix from media to tech to retail of experts in the outdoor industry who have not only been part of the industry previously, but are part of defining what it looks like and how it's influencing various factors, including cities and what it looks like in cities. So I'm really excited to introduce Scott McGuire of the Mountain Lab, Alyssa of Hip Camp, and Abigail of Outside Magazine. And I'm gonna actually let them introduce themselves in a second. But just a little announcement before that, we are using the hashtag SXOutdoors for this panel. So if you are sharing anything on Twitter, and at the end when we're doing questions, you're gonna wanna use that hashtag so that we can all communicate, and I definitely encourage everyone to tweet it up. So we're gonna do some fun intros right now. The question is, what is the coolest outdoor adventure you've done, and also who are you?
Starting down here?
Yes.
I'm Scott McGuire. I'm with the Mountain Lab. We're a brand strategy organization that's based in California. I have a long background in pretty traditional outdoors, and in the last probably half decade have been focusing more on this intersection where urban and outdoor are starting to coalesce. Background was more as a dirtbag. Probably the coolest outdoor experience I've had was I spent about 5 weeks roughly circumnavigating a group of islands called the Islands of Four Mountains in the Aleutian chain. It's a pretty cool experience to be in that remote of a place. No sign of other human life, no one else around. And if you haven't ever been to that place where you have no digital connectivity of any kind and it's toes in the sand, no other people around, it psychologically changes you that re-entry back in was really difficult. Even going to a place like Anchorage felt like I'd landed in New York City on a Friday night. It was just really amazing.
Awesome. Alyssa?
Hi, my name's Alyssa. I'm the founder of Hip Camp. Hip Camp is the best way to discover your next great camping adventure. We have the most comprehensive resource for camping on public land, all the public campgrounds, whether it's a state park or a national park. And we're also working with private landowners to unlock access to new places to camp. So it might be a big nature preserve or a farm or a ranch or even tribal land. So we're very excited about connecting urban people with the outdoors and in general making nature a lot more accessible. It's really hard to pick one outdoor adventure. I would have to say the one that comes to mind is my first solo camping trip. I went kayaking on Tamales Bay, which is actually pretty close to San Francisco, where I live, and paddled across this little bay and got to pick out a campsite on this cool little beach under an oak tree, and learned that I can totally live by myself outdoors and make my own fire, and it was a really important little trip for me, so that would be mine.
That is good. Yeah. I'm Abby Wise. I am the news editor and social media manager at Outside Magazine. If you aren't familiar with what we cover, we write about everything from like climbing to camping to kayaking to skiing. And we're about to celebrate our 40th anniversary, which we're stoked about. But yeah, it's really fun. And we recently, I guess more and more have been seeing like more coverage or covering more of like outdoor life in cities and in more like urban environments. So I think it's a really important topic and issue, and we're excited to talk about it. But my favorite, well, I guess my most like ill-advised outdoor adventure. I like to try new outdoor sports a lot, and a few years ago, my best friend and I decided we should pick up kayaking. We thought, wouldn't it be cool if we just like bought some kayaks and we went on like a few-day like kayak trip down a river? So we did it, and it was great. We like fished and camped along the way, went downstream somewhere in New Hampshire for like, I don't know, a few days. Realized, oh, we have to get back to work in like a day and a half now. How are we gonna get back up the river? So we ended up hitchhiking and running and hiking back. But it was a really great experience in that I think it shows you, I don't know, you should never be afraid to try a new outdoor activity.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And so, yeah, to dive right in, we're talking about the shift to more outdoor culture and outdoor recreation in cities with city dwellers. So how would we define that shift? What are the points where we've witnessed change? And how is this different from 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Let's start with Scott. Why not?
Start down this end. I think one of the biggest shifts we've seen is that you start talking 20, 30 years ago when we had more of a suburban or a rural environment. A lot of people grew up in outside experiences. It was more a part of life. And as we become more urbanized and as people have less and less exposure to nature, even things as simple as kids going to school where they're walking down concrete or they're being transported in a vehicle and it's not the walk across the park through the forest to school experience, we became more removed from that. And my sense is that in the last 5 to 10 years in particular, there's been a strong pull emotionally from people to say they recognize that that's missing from their life, that connectivity can only get you so far. There's something about that inherent experience of being outside in fresh air that you were talking earlier about, those 5 senses and being able to tap into those 5 senses, that people have started to return to that and seek that out. And in city environments, it seems like there has been a strong opportunity for people to go support each other in that experience. That it used to be that it was your uncle, your grandfather, or someone that took you on that experience. Now it's become more peer oriented. It's, hey, let's go for a walk over in the East Bay Hills this weekend. We can go do this together. And so as that peer community has helped foster that more so.
I think like the development of like different kinds of gyms and stuff in cities is really making a difference there. We were just talking about right before this how like rock climbing used to be something that like your grandfather taught your father, who taught you, or you found a mentor. And now it's really, I mean, there's so many rock gyms popping up all over the country. You can just like go and take a beginner class and like go as a complete like newbie and learn how to climb. And hopefully learn to do it well and safely so that you can take it outside and do it safely. But I think that sort of like new trend, people experimenting with different kinds of fitness is really making a difference in changing the way we view outdoors in cities.
Yeah, and the other big trend that I would add on there is technology. I mean, I think we've all just had our phones and our internet and our websites and our social media become such a part of our daily, if not hourly life, that people are starting to realize, wow, I need a break from this. And the outdoors providing a place to really have that breath and that chance to disconnect a little bit, which can be really helpful. And also I think it's the technology. I mean, with Hip Camp, we're biased. We are a website. We are a tech company. But I think the technology and the chance to connect online is fostering a lot of those offline experiences and making them more accessible. So whether it's Meetup and you're meeting people in your city who want to go hiking, or Hike It Baby, which is this massive, quick-growing community of moms that are meeting online and taking their babies on their first hikes, or Hip Camp, working to make the data about public land more accessible. Technology is helping us connect with the outdoors in kind of a roundabout way as well.
I think that's an interesting juxtaposition where that there's a desire to escape from technology, but technology is facilitating and encouraging people to go do that. When you see on Instagram your friends going to this place, it helps encourage that, but then the desire is to then go do something that's not going to happen inside of a device. And so that's an interesting paradigm to be in, where one facilitates and encourages, but you're actually trying to escape that thing that pushed you there in the first place.
But at some point you probably have to take out your phone and take a selfie, right? That's the yeah, I mean, I think that actually kind of brings up the question of where is that line, and what's, I mean, for Hip Camp you could use the technology beforehand, but there are other technologies where you might need to pull out your phone, and there's definitely increased service, cell phone service, and all of that in wild places. So where is that? Like, is it okay, I guess, to be doing that? And is there a line, or is that something that's always going to be evolving as new technology comes in?
I feel like it's always evolving. We published a feature like maybe a year ago now on a map maker, and she was talking about how her friend was taking her, she was in Patagonia, I believe, and taking her around to these like epic spots. But he kept begging her for like his very favorites. He's like, please don't put this on the map. Please don't. And she respected those requests. And so I think, I mean, map making has been around forever, right? And so if we're seeing that like as far back as map making goes, I mean, I don't think it's a new problem that we have, but definitely an evolving one.
I think that interactions can be, that line as it shifts is part of the old outdoor and the new outdoor and what's shifting there. I live in a small mountain community that's well outside of an urban center, and about 4 or 5 years ago I saw a couple that was hiking up the canyon behind my house, and they had their phones out, and they did not look anything like traditional outdoor. Like they had come straight out of Venice, driven up in their car, went out to go for a hike, and were taking pictures of their phones. And some of the people I was hiking with kind of poo-pooed them, like, look at the hipsters trying to take pictures and not going to be able to post their pictures from here because there's no cell service. On the other side of that couple had stopped, had acknowledged flowers, had acknowledged the stream, had been there, and they weren't on a mission to go accomplish something. They were documenting this cool experience that had got them out of their car, that had got them off the side of the highway. And I think that's that big shift, is where traditional outdoors very much no technology, no communication. And there's this shift now where it's like, well, if that's going to be what gets people to drive from LA up to the Sierras and get out of their car and to go 3 miles up a trail, then let's encourage that. Like, why do we have to poo-poo that if that's what's going to get people to have that experience? Because then that person becomes an advocate for protection, for access, for egress through private land. It's really important.
I do think there's a cultural evolution there of, oh my gosh, a lot of phones do work in parks now, right? It's one of the biggest trends in campgrounds today is, oh my gosh, let's add Wi-Fi. And I might be a little old school there. I love turning my phone off, so that doesn't excite me personally. But for a lot of people, it does kind of help them stay connected, which is, again, makes it more accessible. At the same time, you then see people walking around your campground having a conference call. And that's now, infringing on your ability to disconnect. So I think it brings up this interesting question of, where do my rights stop and where do yours begin? And, this is our public land, this is our nature. Like, where does that line get drawn?
Well, and I think, even some of the Park Service is starting to implement some of these features for their own, reasons. I know. Instagram.
They want you to be able to Instagram from national parks. Huge priority.
Yeah, that's how. But that's how their idea there is that, we have this older generation who loves our parks and supports our parks, but what happens when those people are gone? We need to inspire a new generation to come through, and if getting on Instagram and saying hashtag find your park is the way to do that, then maybe that is the way to do it.
Hashtag find your park on the left.
Yes. Yes. And those are beautiful pictures. But yeah, if that's gonna get 20-somethings excited about getting outside, awesome. But I also think, I know Zion is implementing this new feature, or may or may not, but is considering it, where it's sort of like a flash flood service to your cell phone. After all of the tragedy that happened there recently with all the flash floods. It's sort of their way of, because you can't predict a flash flood coming, so this is their way of pinging your cell phone. You may be out in a canyon and it's oh my gosh, flash flood is coming, get out, as a way to save lives. So it's not only about taking a pretty picture, spreading the word. I think there are much deeper issues below that.
And again, back to the access, people who didn't have the opportunity to learn how to use a map and a compass can now go into the backcountry, because guess what? They can use their iPhone and they don't even need cell coverage. They have GPS. So the technology does, I think, kind of help build that bridge.
Yeah, so that kind of, I guess, one barrier that we've seen that was around before, skills, as well as just general knowledge of what was out there, has been alleviated in part by social media and tech. And I guess I just kind of wonder if there are other barriers to entry that have changed or shifted over time since this, we can use the word shift, I guess, we don't use the word trend, but this shift started as more people who live in urban environments, as more people who live in urban environments are able to, or are wanting to go outside. So is it that they potentially didn't know about it before, or they didn't feel like they had the skills? What were those things that had to change to get more people interested?
I think one of the things is the visual. Like if we're looking at the pictures up here, you know, the bottom center photograph, in my view, is like that was traditional outdoor, and there's an intimidation factor with that image being in that place, right? Like that feels, for a lot of us, that feels intimidating. Where the top right photograph, it's kind of like I can see myself there in that place. And I think as we shifted the communications, the outdoor industry recognized that not everything was going to be someone hanging their ass off a cliff on a rope in a terrifying, you know, cliffhanger-like episode. It's like, you know, maybe just being outside can be fun. It doesn't have to be intimidating. And I think the industry had to recognize that it didn't have to out-scare everyone else to be more core. It's, you know, there's I'll reference North Face. If you saw, you know, 5 years ago, I worked at North Face, and everything was about the technical side of things, right? It was always the image of someone on a scary peak, and they just launched their first global ad, and it's people sitting around a campfire drinking beer, playing guitar, and jumping off a bridge and going swimming. And so when you have an industry leader that shifts their marketing to say, you know, being outside doesn't have to be this death-defying thing, it suddenly becomes more inclusive. And we're just, I think, barely at the opening up of saying it doesn't have to be this way.
Definitely. And just, I want to give a shout out there to Polar Stuff and A-Light. Those are two of the brands that I saw that really kind of emerged a few years ago with this whole new way of portraying people in the outdoors and marketing as something that anyone can do. You don't need to be an extreme athlete. You don't need to have a huge list of skills and mountaineering certificates. You can just go. And I think that's a really important part of this movement, is the portrayal of nature as somewhere where we belong. It's not something we conquer. It's part of us, and we're part of it, and it's very natural for us to be out there, no pun intended. So that's part of what makes me so excited about this.
I think as a magazine, we really struggle with this question a lot because, you know, part of us, I mean, we need to cover these like epic, you know, Alex Honnold like free soloing these epic climbs. Like that's an important thing in our world. Plus he's a really interesting guy and like we should talk about him. But at the same time, you know, most of our readers aren't doing that themselves. Most of our readers are just learning to trail run, and maybe they're going for a 5-mile jog through the trail today, you know? So I think we actually, in our office, we talk a lot about that balance, and we really try to provide both worlds, because you want something to strive for. You know, maybe you aren't going to be like a base jumper, like, you know, wingsuiting off of cliffs, but maybe you'd be open to like slacklining across one if you're tied in, which you should be. But, you know, and I think, so you want, on one side you want the thing that you're shooting for that maybe is a little more intimidating, maybe looks like that picture. But on the other side, you also want like 5 simple breakfasts that you can make that's gonna help like fuel your next run or whatever. So that's a balance, like we try and find that every day.
And I think just a really important part of the context of, I think, why this is all so important is that a lot of our land today in the United States that's open is under threat. And there are people who think we don't need all these, you know, open plains and mountains. Those could be malls, those could be oil fields, those could be, you know, things we're making money from. And it's really important that, I think, as an industry, as the outdoor industry, that we say, okay, well, there's a lot of people who benefit from this, and let's try to expand that demographic. Let's try to be more inclusive. And I think that bottom middle photo is totally right. That's pretty exclusive. Not everyone can do that. So it's part of, I think, this big alliance building.
There's 2 things real quick on that. If you guys are interested in this, she mentioned Polar Stuff. If anyone's interested, you should Google a TED Talk from Benji Wagner on Frozen, spelled P-H-R, about looking at your phone and being frozen in your phone and the power of it. It's a really, really good talk. There's also that access and what that means. There's some cool research that's being done now with the Sierra Club and with UC Berkeley on the environment, the health benefits of being outside, where they're measuring the cortisol stress levels of people on a Friday, and then they take them out and put them in nature, and then come back and measure those same stress levels on a Sunday. And it's one of the things that we don't think about, is that our natural resources are some of the best medicine we have for the day-to-day stresses. And it's like, you know, before you go to the doctor and get a pill to make your stresses go away, maybe you should just go camp for a weekend. It's like, you know, a tent costs a little less than a year or 2 worth of meds to try and take your stress away. And I think that's also starting to be there, where people are like, you know, maybe chemistry and technology can't fix everything. A little nature dose is going to do the trick.
I just want to add too, I mean, it's awesome. We all love to like escape the city and go camping and stuff, but what's great about this shift in outdoor culture, I think, is that you don't have to escape the city to be outside. I know, we always do a roundup of like best towns, and some of them are really tiny mountain towns every year, and some of them are, Austin was on the list recently, and they have, I think it's over half of their streets have designated bike lanes. So like, you can go hop on a bike and have hopefully a very safe bike ride and get outside that way. You don't necessarily have to like load up your car and like drive 2 hours out into the wilderness. So
Yeah, I think that's how many people had to wait in line to get their badge, right? Like, there's a lot of people, and if you walk 2 blocks or a block from behind here, there's the boathouse, and it's amazing to think that you can be in this packed place full of people, and a block away you can sit on the water and watch cormorants and birds and be right there in nature, and it like brings us down. You're like, okay, and I'm gonna walk back into the crowds. Like, I think that a lot of cities in the urban planning have also recognized that even just bike lanes, walking paths, the Central Park kind of mindset in smaller cities has done a lot to help increase access to that.
And I guess, so this visual. So on the left, we have someone doing something pretty intense, and on the right, we have someone smoking and standing outside. And they're pretty extreme images, but Abby before mentioned indoor climbing gyms, and Central Park is also a great example of a very different experience in the outdoors than someone who is outside climbing on real rock, or someone who goes hiking in a national park. And is there a distinction that you guys see? Is it all still outdoors? And does including something like a walk in Central Park into outdoors kind of dilute it for the the person, or the groups, the brands who represent the people on the left? And how will this definition change? Will it? Because it has, right? In the past few years, the definition of outside and outdoors, and what does that mean for the larger idea of outdoor recreation?
I think one of the biggest shifts is that both people are having a motivational experience, and they're choosing where they're at on this spectrum of having that motivational experience. It's one of those things, like if you've never traveled outside your hometown, then going to the next city down the road is pretty telling. If you grew up traveling all over the world, then you probably want to go to some place that no one's ever heard of for your experience. And so at the end of the day, someone's still just trying to have this experience outside, and everyone's on a different spectrum. And I think that's one of the things that shifted, is that the person on the right recognizes that the person on the left is still just trying to have an experience, and one's not more right or better than the other. It's just somewhere along that paradigm, or along that spectrum of where they're at.
I hope that they both recognize that. I don't know that, I think there's something in the outdoor industry, there can be a little bit of, it gets a little snobby sometimes, You're out at the crag, and, you're climbing, and there's some, like, newbie over there, and, I remember 10 years ago when, it was empty here. And I think, unfortunately, we do see a lot of that in some of the outdoor world, and I think that's why technology is really helping bridge that gap, or I would like to think it is, at least. But I think that's why this discussion is so important, because we need to try and remove that. We need to make sure that everyone realizes that hiking a mountain in your backyard is just as valuable as summiting Everest in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a fascinating point. That's actually a big thing of what led us to working with private landowners to unlock access to new places. Is we had enough data to realize, wow, if you live in a city, if you live in an urban area, your campgrounds are probably booked up 6 months in advance, and even if you want to get outside, you can't. There's too many people there, and totally the old timers are like, well, 20 years ago there was no one there, this sucks, your website's so, it's blowing up our spots. And so we're like, okay, we'll create new ones, and we'll work with private landowners to do that. And so it's definitely a big part of what is driving our company.
And I guess just to take it to the next level of, looking at these two pictures and talking about the spectrum, what about people who dress like they like to go outdoors but don't actually go outdoors? Specifically, I am talking about the lumbersexual, which is a trend we have all seen, and something that I think definitely comes up when there are people wearing clothing that makes it look like they spend a lot of time outdoors, and more often than not they live in cities. So yeah, what is this relationship between this style really and outdoor culture, and is there any crossover at all?
It's very strange, I think, to witness, but I do think, so we were just talking about, my friend just published this article about, it was called like Fritz Goes to Lumberjack Camp, I think.
Or the politics of the lumbersexual.
That's what it became. But within our office, it was like, we're sending Fritz to like go be a lumberjack. And so it's this company that is in New York, and right now they're hosting these camps where you can sign up and learn lumberjack skills. You can learn how to like throw knives, chop wood, do all that good stuff. But you're still outside, you're still like outdoors in the woods, which is great. However, their next goal is to create gyms around this lumberjack lifestyle. So think of it as like the new CrossFit, right? Like you can like go to a gym in Brooklyn and like chop some wood, and that's how you're gonna get your workout. And I know that there's something to be said about getting people outside and showing them these skills. If they're excited about it and they want someone to teach them, that's great. However, part of me also laughs a little bit at this idea of like, let's go to the gym and chop wood. That's a little weird.
Do you have the image?
I do, yeah, it's just about to, there we go. So
I love this.
Yeah, anyone?
I think that there was this one always, and I like the elephant in the room for me is that I work in the consumer products industry, and so I work helping brands that sell to this customer, which in some ways pains me. I do think that that part of what drove this trend was a desire for people to try and connect back to something that's natural, and then that trend morphed into a fashion thing where it just became, at least from the outsider's perspective, a ridiculous joke, right? Like there's another meme that went around that said, if you dress like this and you don't know how to change a tire, you need to shave, which I thought was pretty appropriate. But I do think that fundamentally what originally drove this was that lack of natural skills. Like people didn't know where their food came from. They didn't have any connection to outdoors, and I think that's what fostered it, and then it went to that next level where it became a fashion trend. And thankfully, all the trend forecasters have shown that this has been dying for the last couple of years. And sadly, with the outdoor industry usually being about 5 years behind trend, it means we've got a half a decade of still seeing Buffalo Check in stores, but we're getting there. But it did start something where people recognized they were lacking some outdoor connection. And I think that there's that fine line, like the lumberjack school that gets someone to go out and be in nature is a cool experience, but the idea of someone going and chopping wood in Brooklyn to get physically fit seems like an odd trend. It's a one-off. My biggest concern when I see this is that this is going to end up killing that. People are actually going to turn away from wanting to have natural experiences because they're going to be afraid of being associated with a negative trend. And that's the biggest risk I think we face with this. People are like, I'm definitely not going to tell anyone I can't because people are going to think I'm a lumbersexual, which then becomes the negative side of it. That's one of our great risks.
So I think this is great, with asterisks, but this is a big cultural shift that we're in the middle of, and I don't think it's dying out. I think this is part of the local food movement, and this is part of the craftsman Americana heritage movement. Like this is us returning to basics, and kind of with urbanization and technology, I think this is a very natural counter trend, with the exception that I do think we need to be aware of cultural appropriation, which doesn't always need to be coming from different ethnicities. It can be culturally appropriating the lifestyle of a farmer or a lumberjack and not understanding. I mean, cultural appropriation is defined by imitating a culture without understanding or respecting the context. So I think in a lot of these cases, the companies doing this do, like this lumberjack, gym, they love lumberjacks. Like, they really mean it. It's coming from a place, wood chips, it's coming from a place of really respecting and seeing huge value in this culture. And so for me, as long as it's coming from that place, it's all good.
Okay, all right. And I guess building on that, you mentioned the farm to table movement. What about like a field to table movement? I mean, that guy has an axe. But yeah, what about, an increase in people looking to hunt and fish for their own food and also being urban dwellers?
Yeah.
And yet, is that also something that will keep increasing? And is it important to this larger culture of people wanting to return to nature and wear flannel and be like lumberjacks?
Well, and know where like your food came from, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're seeing that everywhere in cities all over the country. And I mean, we were talking about, there's a little bit of a scare factor involved, right? Like, you're not growing carrots in your backyard. Like, you're gonna go like shoot a deer and like bring it home for dinner, But maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a way to sort of bridge that transition. I don't know, smooth it out, make it a little less intimidating. I mean, I know you feel that there is.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this movement. I think that anyone who is actually doing the work of gathering or hunting or foraging for their own food, from my experience, tends to have a very deep connection with land. And I think that a lot of people are kind of inspired by that and want to be part of it. I know, Mark Zuckerberg, only ate meat he killed, and maybe still does, and definitely did for like a year or two. And that was really because I want to know where this pig grew up. I want to know the context in which it was killed, and I want to know what that feels like before I enjoy bacon. And so I think that is I think it's really interesting. I think it comes from a really deep place, and I look forward to exploring it more.
I think one of the big advantages with technology is that the major players in the industry no longer have control over the message that goes out there, and so we're seeing people that are coming in and changing that dialogue. There's a brand in California called Bass Brigade, and they basically make a lifestyle bass fishing brand that fits much more in an urban environment. And they had one of the ads they came out with was a young kid that's going to go ride his skateboard with his fishing rod in his backpack down a graffitied street with chain link to go fish at 6 o'clock in the morning on a golf course before anyone gets there. And that's one of those things, like, to me, when we start to see that, when you get that exposure, it's amazing. It's really cool, because the traditional field and stream guy going bass fishing is definitely not that guy, and they're choosing to have their outdoor experience on their own terms. And whether it's Instagram or social media, other channels and web, they get to build their own tribe around that culture that's theirs, and they get to define it. And so they don't have to be they're not waiting for the Cabela's to recognize that customer exists. They're just going to do it on their own. And I think we're going to see that more and more and more, where people are going to be able to create that own culture on themselves. They're not going to wait for someone to recognize that they're a valuable asset. They're going to we're going to have the experience ourselves. We don't need to wait for you.
Yeah, and I think the recognition that hunting and fishing is not incompatible with environmentalism is this very cool thing that in Texas has been a big part of the culture for a long time, but in a lot of other places, I think people are kind of just catching up. So I met this wonderful woman last week who is just published a book called Field to Table, which is a cookbook based on recipes where you're foraging and hunting for all the primary ingredients. And she said, look, I'll hug a tree with one hand and hold a gun with another. That's not a problem for me. Those two worlds that's me, and that's what I believe. So
Yeah, and I think also there's quite a few new products that make more accessible to grab a fishing rod and head out if you do live in a place. I come from New York City, so space is really limited. So this is happening not just with fishing rods, but also with kayaks and with other products that you can potentially put under your bed or in a closet. And and that kind of reduces that other barrier of gear, right? Because a lot of these sports are gear intensive. And I guess a question that is important to this entire discussion is cities are really big, diverse places. And the outdoors and the outdoor industry and the people who participate have traditionally been a very small group, generally like very Caucasian, like 70-something%, I think is the statistic, people who participate consistently. So as outdoor culture becomes more entrenched in cities, are there still barriers, and will diversity of cities be reflected in diversity in the outdoors and outdoor culture? And if not, why? What's the issue?
So, middle-aged white guy, outdoor industry, stereotype, right? It's going to shift no matter what, right? Natural experiences belong to everyone. I think the only question is whether or not the industry moves with what's happening in society, or the industry just gets pushed out of the way and society defines it. But it's not a question of if, it's how, because that's just the reality. Like, that's exactly what's happening, and it's slow. I mean, the industry's been really, really, really slow to recognize the change, but it's a matter of fact. And I think that there are brands, like Bass Brigade, that they're changing their communication because they're appealing to an audience that the rest of the industry can't recognize. And at some point, you get to the tipping point, sadly, where everyone recognizes that they're missing out on market share because they haven't been able to market to the audience that's there, and so they suddenly shift their marketing. But I don't know if the major players are going to be able to make that adaptation in time, or if they're going to get pushed out of the way, and you're going to have the next group of products and brands that have already been able to adapt to be there. But the idea that you can be of a different ethnicity, that you ride a skateboard and you still want to go bouldering, like, those are all things that are happening very much so every single day right now. And the industry still is kind of like, but that doesn't look like us. It's like, oh, no shit. The world doesn't look like it did 40 years ago. So that's happening.
And I think talking about being more inclusive also applies to like the LBGT community. We published this article on, this is Wes Seiler, who's amazing. We just got his column. We're super excited about it. Shameless plug. But
check it out.
Called Indefinitely Wild. But yeah, so we published this article about sleep systems for couples and like the best way to stay comfortable when you're camping with your significant other. And this was our lead image. And we got such a huge, huge response from it saying, thank you Outside for being inclusive. Thank you for, showing that this is for everyone. And that really, that blew our minds, because I think on one hand, it's really great that we got that response. And it's great that people recognize that there's a problem there. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think it's really scary that just publishing one article with this image on it drummed up that much attention. Like, that shows that we really, really lack diversity, and we need to be more inclusive in our industry, just like across the board.
And I think the first step there is really becoming aware of how the history of the outdoors has progressed, and understanding that, John Muir was a total racist, and black people weren't allowed in parks 50 years ago, literally. And it's just really like, we need to understand that and not just pretend like that's not real to even begin to approach, solutions. You talked about participation numbers and a lack of diversity there, but management of parks numbers are even worse. And those are the people who are designing campgrounds and parks. And a great example is, the Latino families love to, the familia is a much bigger thing. It's not two kids and a parent and parents. It's a big family event, and campgrounds aren't designed for that. And so it's kind of this bigger thing of not just, I think as an industry with imagery, making, the representation more accurate, but also from a management and strategy perspective, making sure that the viewpoints and the different cultures are being taken into account from a much earlier stage will kind of be essential to this.
Yeah, and I guess the last question before we move into questions from all of you is this here to stay? We've talked about different elements of outdoor culture in cities and groups and who's participating, but are we going to continue to see growth at the level that we've seen it? Is it going to plateau? Is this a trend and people are going to move on to something different and exciting in a year or two? What do you guys think?
looks down here. I think we've just scratched the surface. That the urbanization and the move to the urban areas has changed dramatically. A place like Utah is now considered 81% urban. So in the last census, that's a pretty significant shift from what was rural. So we still, I think, while we've seen growth, we've still barely scratched the surface of people that have had exposure to outside experiences. Tons of communities that are just now getting that initial taste of what that feels like. And I think some of the research that you guys are working on as people come out there, we're not going to stop being a connected society. We're not going to stop being a highly pressurized society tomorrow. And so I think that the seeking of those outlets to be able to then kind of connect back to something that feels meaningful is going to be important. And it's the subtle things, like people now spending more time building like a little tiny garden in their backyard, or the backyard chicken coop. That might be a novel little urban trend, but I still think it taps in this thing of like, I'm connected to this natural experience, and maybe not everyone's going to have the space to put a chicken coop on their patio, but I still think that we've just started to be able to get people exposed to that, and that's going to continue. What it looks like, if it's going to look like today, if those outdoor experiences are the same, could be very, very different. May not be climbing gyms, may not be stand-up paddleboarding. I think all that's going to shift, but inherently, people like the experience of having those senses alive.
I certainly hope that it's here to stay, but I sort of feel like it's a bit of a trend right now. I think that the way we see it is a bit of a trend, and I think, look at social media. Social media is always changing. There are always new platforms jumping up, and right now, Instagram is like the place to take your like cool pic of your summit and like hashtag find your park. And that's great. And I hope that sparks, the interest, and now your friends want to go hike that peak as well. However, I would argue that in like 5 years, hopefully those people are still hiking, but they're probably not taking pictures of their summits and posting it on Instagram because, I don't know, maybe we have a new social media platform. Maybe we aren't this like crazy social media, country anymore, world, I guess, anymore. So I think that what is important now is sparking that interest and drumming up that excitement around the outdoors so that we get people who remain invested in our nature, and are there even when there aren't epic like selfies on Instagram.
I think we are seeing the very beginnings, like the kind of trendy, exciting part of what I view as a fundamental, realignment with humans really rediscovering our place in the natural world and wanting to integrate that into our lives. So I look at this as a very kind of fundamental cultural shift where we're recognizing, we weren't meant to live in gray boxes and drive in metal boxes to our gray boxes. I think that's something that as a species we're waking up to, and so I don't think we're gonna forget that again anytime soon. At least I hope not.
So now, what we're gonna do with questions is just ask you guys to tweet them with this hashtag, and then we'll read them out and try to answer them. So I'm gonna go on Twitter, see what's happening.
Hopefully somebody asked a question.
Yeah, ask questions. Yeah, you can just ask.
Analog.
I'm kind of surprised I didn't hear the term glamping at all.
Oh.
Ah.
Whoa.
And what is its part in this conversation and this culture?
Glamping is a very controversial topic. It really is. It's very polarizing. As a camping company, we get haters and lovers of extreme passion from both sides. I think it's cool. I think for me, it's a way for people who are afraid of not having nice linens and a comfortable, mattress to still be able to get outside. And again, in my mind, that's a good thing.
But on the other hand, there is something to be said, I think, about if you're going to spend time outside, like actually be outside. I actually recently saw some campgrounds that have like swimming pools and movie theaters. And like to me, you're right. Maybe that's going to attract someone who wouldn't have otherwise gone camping, and that's good. On the other hand, I think that if you're gonna go camping, man, just like go camping. Like, why do you need to like project a huge movie? I just, that kind of, it blows my mind. But, and the other side of that, I think too, is the gear. Like glamping gear is very expensive, and that really limits the people who can enjoy glamping, right? If you can't afford that gear, you can't go. So I think like traditional camping or hiking or whatever it may be is probably more inclusive to everyone.
Can we take questions, Sarah, from?
Yeah, totally. Do we have a microphone, or I guess?
Right here.
Perfect. Yes.
Live from Austin.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Love your panel. I program for an art and nature park here in Austin called Laguna Gloria, and I'm interested in the sort of tension between having an outdoor experience and technology. So you talked about the role of technology and sort of giving people access, helping them find gear, people documenting their experience. Are you finding people who have outdoor spaces using technology well as a way to share information that they would have, given a printed brochure or something instead? And is this new audience or this expanded millennial audience, do they want to get it through the device that they get most of their information, or is it use technology to get me outside and then turn it off and have that pure experience?
I think.
Go ahead.
I'll weigh in on this actually, because one of the things that we do is called Mappy Hour, where we have people bring maps of the places they want to go and hang out. And that's the entire premise of the event. And people love it. And I think a huge reason is because they want to be able to physically have maps in their hands and use them and talk to other people and gather around it and have that physical thing that connects them to the outdoors. So I'd say there is still a huge amount of that, at least that I've been able to see. And we only really work with people who live in cities, and they want to bring their maps, they want to see new maps and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think the tactile experience is pretty important when you're getting outdoors. You can't just do it all digitally.
I think it's a really great question. I know it's one a lot of park agencies are kind of grappling with, and I think it really comes down to personal preference. So for me, I like to use technology to get outside and then probably not pick my phone up again. But there are definitely creative ways to use it. I don't think they have to be diametrically opposed all the time.
I think there's also like a huge community around that, like sharing information. I mean, if you look at like the Mountain Project, that's where climbers go and they document their climbs and they comment on like which ones were better and how they're graded. And that's something, that helps me every time I go on a climbing trip. I couldn't do it as easily without, I could go pick up a book, or I could like study beforehand, but it's just so convenient to like have my cell phone there and be like, okay, here I am, at Red Rocks, what should I climb? So I think that in some ways it's not only convenient, but it's like really a positive experience of like discovering new things through technology.
Yeah, the Audubon Society has a great app on birds, and I use it a lot when I go with hikes with my kids, because we'll go through and you can search by the area. So I can say, okay, we're in a subalpine, we're here, it's this time of year, and it's like, okay, here's the 15 birds, and you can hear their bird call on the phone. No, it's the Audubon Society app. And unfortunately, they had an app that actually had flowers and trees and animals and tracks and everything, and they've now broke them all apart. But with the bird app, it's great, because like with my 5-year-old, I can go through and be like, okay, here's the 4 birds we're going to hear, and we can play them, and he can hear them, and then we go for a walk, and he'll be like, oh, there's the Clark's Nutcracker, I heard that. So it can be that association, that teaching tool, that experience that I can't mimic that sound, and I can't get that out of a book, but now I have a 5-year-old who can probably identify a dozen birds because of that. And so this is what Benji talks about in his talk. There's, I think, ways that technology doesn't have to be negative. You can use it that way. But if you're constantly there all the time, like 40 selfie pictures, and you haven't actually noticed anything around you, then technology's become a barrier. So I think you can't, there's not a black and white line where you can judge that it's pro or con. It's in the usage and in the intent of the usage.
And I really like it as being used by a human interpreter to carry other kind of media through it. So I've seen Shazam for plants, where you can like take a photo of a plant and it'll identify it, or the You can hold it up to the sky and understand the different constellations. I think those kinds of things, if used in the right way, can be really powerful education tools. That's a real thing.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think Benji's talk again, can't speak highly again of it enough. I think that'd be a great resource.
All right.
Hi. So you mentioned that being outside should be a health right for everyone, which I think is really powerful. And I was wondering how you think the industry is working to make that more accessible for disabled people living in cities. Is that something that's a topic that's often discussed?
Yeah, I think what is the climbing
Yeah. So.
Paradox.
Yeah. What's that?
From Outdoor Fest?
Yeah, we do a fundraiser with a group called the Adaptive Climbing Group. And so it's an indoor event at a climbing gym, but what it does is support, use that money really to go back into that community, because it takes so much more to be able to belay someone who is in a wheelchair, let's say, or to provide the support that people who need it for disabilities, need. So that organization's based in Brooklyn, and they're starting to spread out, but they're just one example of an organization that has grown, and it started like 3 years ago, so it's newer and part of that inclusivity. But right now it's only in a few cities, and they're working on kind of trying to create the structure that's needed to teach people how to, it's just skills really that weren't taught before and weren't in the climbing gym because no one had come and asked for them.
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because I think that's one of the areas of accessibility that often does get overlooked. And it's really important. So I know that in California, we're not allowed to build any new campgrounds or retrofit any campgrounds without making sure there's access for those with challenges. And so that costs a lot of money, but it's really important, and people are using them. And one of the first things we did when I designed the first version of Hip Camp, which again, I was like, I want to put the state parks and the national parks and the county parks in one place. One of the things that was driving me crazy on the other sites was there was no way to filter up front for campsites that had access for those with challenges, and that was something we built into the product from the original design. With you can check that box, and we'll show you up front where you can go. So we're trying, but I'm sure there's a lot more we could do.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done where, like now where I live, you have paved trails that get to a dock where someone can fish if they're in a wheelchair, but all the hiking trails around are single track dirt. Mm-hmm. And there's a reluctance, like, well, we don't want to pave everything. And I think when we start looking at trail building, there's going to be this question at some point, like, well, can you build trails that are still dirt but are wide enough so if someone was in a non-conventional chair that had mountain bike wheels, there's a gear expectation on the end consumer, but there's still an access that's available. Like, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Yeah. And I think we're just now starting to be able to get to that point where we're seeing that access change and that conversation as we start talking about like trail building and things like that.
Awesome. I'm going to take one Twitter question and then go back to you guys.
Okay.
So just because I don't want to ignore the people that did follow those directions. But you guys are awesome too. It's both great. All right. This one's for Abigail. How does Outside Magazine's Instagram strategy reflect this shift in the outdoor experience? Is it a conscious effort? And that's from Melanie Clancy.
All right. Well, I think our Instagram presence is very still on like the epic side of things. It's like it's more inspirational, I would say, than it is necessarily representative of like all of us sitting here. And I think that's because people go to Instagram to be inspired. You want to go look at those beautiful pictures, and maybe you aren't going to go highline a cliff like 700 feet above a river, but maybe then that inspires you to go try slacklining at your rock climbing gym. So I think our strategy there is really more to take, and we're so lucky to work with such amazing photographers. That is just something that has been our backbone since the beginning. So we have all these beautiful images to choose from, which we love, and we want to like share them with the world. And we hope, I hope that when I post something like that, it does inspire people to get outside.
All right, live question.
Me? Awesome.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I live in the world of brand strategy, and what when I first read the description of this and what this talk has done a good job of is it's the first real conversation I felt where you're not demonizing urbanity at the sake of outdoor culture. And I think there's something as a brand strategist, I'm really interested in the fact that of a symbiotic relationship with the fact clearly globally, suburbs are now big cities, and big cities are now 10 times what they were, and that's clearly because no one's being forced there. There's benefits there. And so I'm really interested in more discussion around how there's almost a symbiotic relationship by the more we crave urban life, the more we make room for outdoor culture. And it doesn't mean a rock climbing gym or that great Bass example you had, Mr. McGuire, but it means like politically we fight for more conservation or blah, blah, blah. And so I would like to A, is that a correct observation? And B, what do you think is kind of like the humanity or cultural behavior on that? Because I think it's one of the very first narratives I've heard around, you're not pitting man against nature or nature versus city. It can actually, both can thrive.
So I have some bias in this one where I think a lot of outdoor trends in the United States have followed Europe. I hope we don't end up in the kind of land conservation issues of Europe. I mean, it's almost impossible to go camping in Europe being in a highly, highly, highly organized campground, which is problematic. But there's a great store in Munich called Globetrotter, and Munich being a pretty urban city, it's amazing because you'll go into the Globetrotter and you'll walk into the shoe wall, and you sit in the shoe department on a Friday afternoon, and you'll watch people that work in the industry in suits and ties and in business attire come in to get their trekking shoes to go to the Alps for the weekend. And no one thinks twice about the fact that people come in dressed like they were coming out of a fashion magazine to try on trekking boots to go for a hike in the Alps on Saturday. Like that's completely normal in a place like Munich. We're just now the novelty of going to Patagonia in San Francisco is actually becoming more practical. And so I'm hoping that the industry shifts more towards that European mindset where the idea that you can be completely comfortable in the city on Tuesday and very happy to be outside overnight looking at the stars on Friday, they don't have to be diametrically opposed. And I think that a lot of the more Alp-centric parts of Europe have been able to do that really well. And I think we're going to see that in the US, and I think the industry is starting to recognize that because it's really difficult to tell people that they have to choose. Right? And what's interesting is that a lot of the athletes that we see as aspirational, they don't choose. Like I had the benefit of working with North Face, and it was amazing. Like you see these people that do just the most amazing things, and when they would come to North Face's offices in the Bay Area, they would love to go out in San Francisco. Like so they were DJs, they were artists, they were super creative. They thrived in the city environment, and they were badasses outdoor, and they didn't have to choose. It's just the marketing tends to only show that one side. It doesn't tend to show both, and so I think we're really getting to that point where that homogeneity is going to exist because that's the reality of the consumer.
I think it's a great observation, and I completely agree. I think there's really good reasons why urbanization is like the defining trend of the century right now. It's opportunity. It's the same reason people have always moved to cities. And from an actual resource and sustainability perspective, it's actually great news for nature. Cities are more efficient at feeding and taking care of lots of humans than any suburban, sprawling landscape ever has been in the history of our species. So there's actually something really positive happening for nature. There's a lot of rewilding happening right now. So there's a lot of land that people lived on before that we don't need so much anymore. I've heard in Russia that's like a huge thing right now. People are moving to the cities, and these places that were paved are now kind of getting rewilded. And so I think it is a really symbiotic relationship. And as long as we don't lose our connection with the land, as long as we don't forget where our food comes from, and we continue to get out there and stay connected with the land, I think it's an extremely positive trend for humans and the planet.
I think I think the next step that I would like to see more of is education. You mentioned conservation. I think that is a huge thing right now, and that's what the Park Service is really trying to implement that. But if you look at the way our parks exist right now, a lot of them are in huge trouble. I mean, the Grand Canyon has like stuff coming. I mean, it's got like a tramway. Thankfully, they just like canceled. We were just discussing they were going to make like a huge like mega mall resort.
With an IMAX theater on the south rim of the Grand Canyon.
But the U.S. Forest Service just last week like cut that, which is great. But you know, a lot of these issues, it's not just the Grand Canyon, it's happening to all of our parks. And I think that, you know, I hope that when someone is inspired to go and check out one of our national parks, I hope that they also take the time to realize that it's about more than just visiting, which is what the National Park Service is trying to do. They're trying to get a younger generation not only visiting, but also invested in conserving all of our public lands. And so I would really like to see more education there. And I think there's work to be done there, but hopefully they'll do it.
All right, and we're almost out of time, so I just wanted to pull this up. There is a happy hour happening tonight, so if you guys are interested, come talk to us. There are limited spaces, but we do want to be able to continue the conversation, especially if you had questions that you weren't able to ask. And do we have time for one more question? Okay, one more question. Yeah.
I'm glad I'll live here. So I'm the director of content and creative for Girl Scouts National HQ. And I just wanted to say, like, you guys articulated so perfectly on this panel a lot of the issues that we struggle with as a huge, national movement. But I wanted to get your individual takes on, do you think this intersection between urban and outdoor becomes even more important for the generations following millennials? What do you guys have to say about that?
Oh, like 1,000%. Totally. I mean, we need this whole shift is just showing, it's engaging a younger generation, new generations are coming, and it's just becoming more and more and more important to not only, like I was saying, not only like get them excited, but also educate them. And because we need everyone to like help take care of our land and be excited about the outdoors and outdoor sports. And
We just hit a tipping point last year where more than half the people in the world live in a city. Huge deal. And in the next, I think it's 20 years, that number is predicted to be 65%. So this is not slowing down, it's speeding up. And figuring out how we deal with it culturally is essential, especially for such a organization like the Girl Scouts with so much influence.
Yeah, I encourage you guys to look at our research as well, proprietary to girls, because you're in outdoor, you're not just in preventative healthcare, you're also in leadership development.
Absolutely.
Right.
You're talking about young girls. So
Yeah.
it's more Girl Scouts education.
It's a whole nother panel, but that's
Wait, can I just say one thing really quick? We are launching a podcast, which we're really excited about. Our first series, it's just called Outside Podcast. It's going to launch on March 21st. Our first series is like a mini 4-episode series about the science of survival. And our first episode is like what it's like to be frozen nearly to death, because you're not dead until, you're not dead until you're warm and dead. Yes. So it's about being frozen to death and then brought back to life and what that feels like. And then we're also going to do like getting struck by lightning, like thirst in the desert. It's going to be really awesome. So you guys check it out.
Woo. And thank you guys all for
Thank
coming.
you. Thank you.